Snow hammered down from a sky the color of old steel, flattening the peaks of the Wyoming range into one endless white mass. The wipers of Ben Taylor's pickup beat furiously but couldn't keep up. He leaned forward over the steering wheel, eyes narrowed, every muscle tight from hours of crawling along a road that had disappeared under drifts. Next to him in the cab, Shadow sat upright on the seat, the old German shepherd's head swiveling like a radar dish. His coat shimmered with melted flakes, the faint scars along his muzzle catching the glow of the dashboard. Ben muttered to himself, a habit left over from deployments. Just a few more miles. We'll be home. Then a low growl rose from Shadow's chest. Deep, deliberate, the kind of sound that didn't mean anxiety, but a decision. Before Ben could react, the dog surged forward, planting his front paws against the dash, nose pressed to the windshield. His ears flattened and then snapped upright, tail stiff. "Shadow, what is it?" Ben's voice cracked. The shepherd shifted, blocking Ben's line of sight with his body. He barked once, sharp and commanding, then leapt down to the floorboard and back up again, as if to force the truck to stop. Ben eased off the gas, instincts kicking in from a life he'd tried to leave behind. He scanned the white blur ahead, searching for angles, shapes, anything out of place. The headlights caught something dark at the edge of the road, metal twisted into a shape no longer recognizable as a car at first glance. As the truck rolled closer, the beam picked out a door ripped open, blue strobe still faintly blinking under layers of snow. A police cruiser. He slammed the brakes. The pickup skidded sideways before biting into the snowbank. Shadow was already whining, pawing at the door handle, muscles bunched as if he would launch himself through the glass. Ben's stomach dropped. Years of trying to stay invisible had ended in a heartbeat. Out here, no one should be on this road, no one except him and his daughter at home, and now a wrecked cruiser and whoever had been inside. He opened his door and was hit by a blade of wind so sharp it stole his breath. Snow swirled in frantic eddies around his boots as he climbed down. Shadow landed beside him, silent now, nose low to the ground. The shepherd pulled forward, his body language all business, no hesitation. "Stay close," Ben said automatically, though he knew Shadow understood more than most humans. They trudged through knee-deep drifts toward the wreck. At first he thought the figure against the rear wheel was a mannequin thrown from the car. Then the head moved. Long dark hair stuck to a pale face, a uniform soaked in blood and meltwater. Her lips moved soundlessly until he crouched close enough to hear a rasp of air. "Please, don't call it in." Ben's mind raced. Officer, young, maybe mid-20s. A wound in her side just below the vest line. No exit. Not from the crash. Knife, work. Deliberate. She was on her knees now, one hand still gripping the edge of the wheel as if it could anchor her to life. Shadow circled once, then placed himself between her and the open road, head turned toward the bend, nostrils flaring. He gave a low growl again, warning of something Ben hadn't yet seen. "Easy," Ben whispered, one hand on the dog's back. To the officer he said, "You're hurt bad. I'm going to get you out of here." Her fingers clamped around his wrist with surprising strength. "No call. They'll kill us both if you call." He stared at her. The words didn't make sense until they did. The tire tracks leading away from the wreck weren't old. The door ripped open clean, not twisted by impact. Someone had done this and left her to die. "Shadow," Ben said. The shepherd moved closer, pressing against the officer's legs, sharing heat, eyes never leaving the curve in the road. Ben's training took over. He tore off his glove, pressed his palm to her wound, felt warm blood against his skin even through the freezing air. He looked back at his truck. The cab was warm, the engine running. but getting her there meant turning his back on whatever had Shadow's hackles up. "Who did this?" he asked. Her breath fogged in short bursts. "Cedar Ridge PD. Not all. Some. Evidence in my pocket." Her hand moved weakly toward her coat. Ben slid his fingers in and pulled out a small USB drive, slick with blood. She gripped his arm again, nails digging in. "If you're going to help me, you take it, you run." Shadow gave a sharp bark that echoed off the trees. A pair of headlights flashed briefly around the bend, then vanished again into the storm. Ben's pulse kicked. Whoever had done this might be circling back. He scooped the officer into his arms, her weight no more than a loaded ruck, and turned back toward the truck. "Shadow, cover," he said. The dog moved ahead of him, every step precise, ears tracking, nose cutting through the wind like a compass. When Ben reached the truck, Shadow sprang into the back seat first, pivoting to face out the window. Only when Ben had slid the officer into the passenger seat and slammed the door did the shepherd settle, still staring out into the dark. Ben climbed behind the wheel, hands slick with blood, heart hammering. He glanced at the USB drive in his lap, then at the woman slumped against the seat, her breath shallow but steady. "What the hell have you dragged us into, girl?" he muttered. Shadow whined once, a sound Ben had learned meant both warning and insistence. He put the truck in gear. The road ahead was white, treacherous, but home was still miles away. Somewhere out there, headlights moved through the storm, and the old shepherd's instincts said the danger wasn't finished. As the pickup lurched forward, the dog shifted closer to the wounded officer, pressing against her with steady warmth. His eyes met Ben's in the mirror, calm but unblinking. This wasn't just rescue. This was a fight already underway. And for the first time in 6 years, Ben felt the old part of himself waking up. The soldier who'd survived ambushes because he listened to the dog beside him. The cabin sat in a wind-swept valley 3 miles off the county road, tucked behind a tree line of ancient lodgepole pines. Snow leaned against the siding like a tired ghost. Inside, the wood stove hummed, casting amber light across a well-lived-in room that smelled faintly of cedar and ash. This was home for Ben Taylor, his daughter Ellie, and Shadow, the German shepherd who hadn't left either of their sides since arriving 3 winters ago. Ben knelt by the stove, feeding logs into the fire with a precision that never quite left him. He moved the way operators moved, no wasted motion, every step silent, intentional. The kind of silence that came not from fear, but from too many years needing to hear trouble before it arrived. He hadn't worn a uniform in nearly a decade, but the war never really stopped echoing. Behind him, on the old corduroy couch, Ellie sat cross-legged in her pajamas, reading out loud from a dog-eared book about foxes and winter dens. Her voice was soft, serious, full of the careful cadence of a child who had learned early that words had weight. She didn't yet know how rare it was to feel safe. While snow fell outside, Shadow lay sprawled across the entryway rug, one ear tracking the girl's voice, the other tuned to the world beyond the walls. His eyes followed Ben's movements, never fully relaxed, even in peace. He didn't sleep the way regular dogs did. Not completely. Not ever. When Ben had first brought him home, Shadow refused to enter the cabin until he'd circled the perimeter. Twice. Even now, 3 years later, he still did a sweep before lying down. The dog had been trained for IED detection in Afghanistan, deployed with a unit that only came back halfway whole. According to the records, Shadow had saved at least 6 lives. According to Master Sergeant Rivas, the man who handed him off to Ben in a snow-choked gas station parking lot, Shadow had saved more than that. He just didn't count the ones who bled out later. "He's like you," Rivas had said. "Wired tight. Doesn't trust easily. but he'll guard that girl like she's the only thing worth saving. Probably 'cause she is." Ellie paused her reading and looked up. "Is Grace gonna die?" Ben turned slowly. She wasn't asking the way most kids asked, looking for reassurance. She wanted truth. "Not if we help her," he said. "But she's hurt bad." Ellie nodded like a little soldier. She looked down at Shadow, who blinked at her, slow and steady. "He knew, didn't he? Before you did." Ben exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, he did." She slid off the couch and curled beside the dog, resting her head on his flank. Shadow didn't move. He adjusted slightly so her feet didn't touch the cold stone hearth. It wasn't affection. It was instinct. The kind of placement you learned when you'd slept next to people who might not wake up. Ben sat on the floor across from them. He watched Ellie stroke Shadow's fur in slow, calming motions. The girl and the dog had developed their own language. She knew how to read the set of his shoulders, the twitch of an ear. He'd learned the difference between her giggle and her sob. Shadow had only barked twice in 3 years. Both times, someone had stepped too close to Ellie. The first time, it was a delivery man who ignored the warning signs posted on the gate. Shadow had waited until the man reached the porch, then stood between him and the door, growling low until Ben called him off. The second time had been a stranger in town, staring too long in the grocery store parking lot. Ben never figured out what Shadow saw in the man's body language, but when the shepherd had put himself between Ellie and the open car door, Ben didn't question it. Tonight, the bond between them felt more vital than ever. Grace Nolan, an officer Ben had never met before tonight, was upstairs in his guest room, bleeding into linens he couldn't afford to replace. She was part of something bigger, something messy, and very likely lethal. The USB drive now sat hidden in a false bottom in the kitchen drawer, next to the M9 Beretta he swore he'd never use again. Ben got up and walked to the window. Snow fell in sideways sheets now, erasing everything beyond 20 feet. Good. It bought them time. He heard Ellie whisper to Shadow, "Don't let the bad guys in, okay?" Shadow didn't respond. He didn't have to. Ben didn't believe in signs, not after everything he'd seen. But if there was one thing he trusted, it was the dog's instinct. Shadow hadn't just sensed danger. He'd made a choice, to stop the truck, to act, to protect. And that had saved a stranger's life. It made Ben wonder, how much danger were they in now? Not in theory. In real, blood-on-the-floor terms. He walked to the base of the stairs and listened. The creak of the old boards under Grace's shifting weight. The ragged wheeze of shallow breathing. A soft, almost inaudible gasp of pain. Ben climbed slowly, every step measured. Grace's gun sat on the nightstand, holstered but within reach. She hadn't wanted to give it up. He didn't blame her. Trust was currency, and they were both broke. She opened her eyes when he stepped into the room. Sweat had matted her hair to her temples. Her lips were pale, cracked. "I know you didn't sign up for this," she said, voice like gravel, dry and worn. "You know who's looking for you?" She nodded. "Some of them are cops. Some used to be. It doesn't matter what badge they wear. They're all working for the same thing now." Ben pulled up a chair. "You trust me?" She gave the smallest nod. "Your dog does." Ben didn't smile. "That's not a small thing." Grace closed her eyes again. He didn't bark. He moved, like he'd done this before. "He has?" He reached over and adjusted the blanket across her chest. She flinched but didn't protest. She was burning up. The fever was climbing faster than he liked. "You need antibiotics. You need a hospital." Can't risk it, not yet. Ben looked out the upstairs window. Snow swallowing the driveway, the trees, the horizon. The storm had bought them a few hours. After that, they were back on borrowed time. Downstairs, Shadow sat up suddenly, ears turning toward the wind. Not barking, just listening. Ellie stirred and followed his gaze. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Shadow's tail flicked once. The kind of movement that meant not yet, but maybe soon. Ben stared into the storm and felt the old gears turning. The soldier he'd buried years ago was rising. Because when a dog like Shadow starts to listen that hard, you'd be a damn fool not to do the same. The cabin had never felt unsafe before. Isolated, yes. Remote. Untouched, but not unsafe. Now every creak of the wood, every whisper of wind against the windows carried weight, a tension that bent the air tight around the walls. And Shadow felt it first. Ben was pouring water into a kettle when the dog stood up from his post near the wood stove. No warning bark, no snarl, just a sudden, silent rise. Head up, tail low and still, ears scanning like antennae. Ben noticed immediately. Shadow moved to the front door and stood perfectly still, nose pointed at the narrow gap under the frame. His body stiffened, one paw lifting ever so slightly from the ground. Then the growl started, low and steady, vibrating through the floorboards. Ben didn't ask what was wrong. He stepped over, crouched beside the dog, and listened. Wind, mostly. But there, beneath it, something different. A soft crunch. Not wind-blown snow. Wait. Footsteps. Ben whispered, "Shadow, confirm." The dog's hackles rose. His tail bristled, not barking, not yet. But his body screamed one thing. Something was out there. Ben quietly moved to the cabinet above the fridge and retrieved the pistol he kept in a lockbox behind the oats. He'd told himself for years it was just for wildlife. Bears, cougars. He hadn't chambered a round since Ellie was born. Now, he did. Upstairs, Grace stirred, her breathing rough. Fever sweat soaked through her borrowed t-shirt. Ben entered the room just as her eyes opened halfway, glassy but aware. "They're looking," she rasped. He froze. "You mean tonight?" She nodded. "They don't leave loose ends." Ben leaned in, voice low and urgent. "You need to tell me who they is, because I think they're on my property right now." Grace tried to sit up and winced, biting back a cry. "USB has names, but they already know what I took. I caught them on camera, logging confiscated guns into evidence, then logging the same serial numbers out again days later, selling them back onto the street." She paused, her breath shallow. "There's a lieutenant, Morrison. He's the one running the pipeline. But he's got others. I don't know how far it goes. Maybe the DA? Maybe the mayor." Ben absorbed that in silence. Downstairs, Shadow barked. Once. Sharp, not a false alarm. Grace reached toward the nightstand where Ben had left her weapon. Her hand trembled. "You need to take your daughter and go. Don't worry about me." Ben didn't answer right away. He helped her sit up and handed her the pistol. Her fingers closed around it with surprising steadiness. "I already helped," he said. "Now I have to see it through." Downstairs, Ellie came out of her room, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy?" Shadow immediately moved to her, standing between her and the front door. Not in panic, but ready, focused. Ben knelt beside her, brushing a hand through her hair. "Remember the cabin game we used to play?" he asked gently. She nodded, a little confused. Where we see who can stay the quietest the longest? Exactly. Let's play it now, okay? I want you and Shadow to stay together. Stay in your room. Don't come out unless I say. Her eyes widened. Is it the bad men? He hated that she asked it so calmly, hated more that she was probably right. Just be my brave girl, Elle, just like we practiced. She nodded once and took Shadow by the collar. The dog didn't resist. He moved with her silently, never looking away from the door until they vanished into her room. Ben returned to the upstairs window and peered out. Nothing but snow. Still, that didn't mean safety. Grace was trying to stand now, holding herself against the doorframe. I recorded everything, she whispered. 3 months of audio, emails, photos of money disappearing from lockers, of drugs going out the back door. I was going to give it to a contact in Denver tomorrow. I never made it. Ben frowned. Why not the FBI sooner? I tried. The contact wanted proof. Said I had to get more, connect the chain of custody. A gust of wind slammed against the side of the cabin, and Ben flinched. Grace didn't. They'll come quiet, she said. They won't use sirens. They'll park off the road and walk in, especially in this weather. Blame it on exposure if something happens. You sure you didn't bring a war to my doorstep? Ben asked, only half joking. I brought the truth. They're the ones who brought the war. A second bark from Shadow, muffled through the wall, cut the conversation. Then a third, short, fast. It was a signal Ben hadn't heard in years, not since Afghanistan. Movement confirmed. Close. 3-point pattern. Ben moved downstairs fast and found Ellie kneeling beside Shadow, who had pressed himself low to the floor, head lifted, ears twitching like radar. What is it, boy? Ben whispered. The shepherd's nose pointed to the rear of the house. Ben didn't waste a second. He flicked off the living room lights, grabbed the lantern from the shelf, and lit it with a practiced hand. He handed it to Ellie. Stay low. If I say run, you take Shadow and head to the wood line. Go north. Stay hidden. Ellie's bottom lip quivered, but she nodded. Okay, Daddy. Ben kissed her forehead. Shadow pressed his body against her again, his breathing steady. He hadn't made a sound since the third bark. That meant the threat was close. Too close for noise. Ben took position near the rear window and waited. The snow outside shimmered under the moonlight. Then it moved. A figure in dark clothing, cutting across the tree line. Not a hunter. Wrong season. Wrong posture. The way they carried the weapon. Low, like muscle memory, not for show. Then a second figure, slightly behind, coordinated spacing. Ben's pulse spiked. And Shadow growled again. Quiet, guttural, old battlefield language. Grace had brought a storm with her, but it was Shadow who knew the wind had teeth, and it was time to bear his own. Ben sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold hours ago. The storm had eased outside, but the quiet felt deceptive, like a battlefield after the last shot, but before the body count. Upstairs, Grace Nolan's labored breathing drifted through the ceiling. He had given her antibiotics, changed the dressing, and forced water down her throat. Still, the fever rose. Her words looped in his head. Names, files, evidence, a corrupted department. It was a story too big, too heavy to accept at face value. Maybe she'd been attacked. Maybe she'd crawled out of that crash. But a ring of dirty cops? A murder plot erased by snow? It sounded like the kind of paranoia he'd seen in soldiers after too many deployments. He rubbed his eyes. You're sick, lady, he whispered to the empty room. You're sick and you're dragging us with you. Shadow lifted his head from the rug. The shepherd's ears pricked at the tone, reading Ben as easily as Ben read terrain. He stood and padded over, placing his chin on Ben's knee. A silent question. A warning. Ben stroked the rough fur absent-mindedly. "We've got a kid to think about," he murmured. "We can't be the cavalry every time someone shows up bleeding." Shadow's tail didn't move. His eyes held steady, not judgmental, but unyielding. Upstairs the bed creaked. Then a thump. Ben was on his feet instantly, Shadow already moving up the stairs before him, claws clicking softly on the wood. They reached the doorway at the same time. Grace was half-dressed, one arm in her jacket, the other gripping the wall for balance. Sweat slicked her face, but her jaw was set in grim resolve. "Where are you going?" Ben's voice was low but sharp. Her eyes flashed. "I can't stay here. I've put you and your daughter in danger. You're not going anywhere in your condition. I won't let them find me here. They'll kill you, Ben. They'll kill your little girl. You think I don't know what happens when they clean up loose ends?" She tried to push past him, but her legs buckled. Ben caught her under the arm, but she shoved him away with surprising strength. "Let me go. You're not thinking straight. You're burning up." Grace's breathing hitched. "You think I'm paranoid, that I'm making it up because I'm sick. I think you're in no state to know what's real right now." Her face crumpled for half a second, hurt, frustration and fear tangling into something raw. "You sound like them, every time I tried to report it. You're seeing things, Nolan. Calm down. That's how they keep it going. They make you doubt yourself." She lurched toward the door. "I'm not staying for your pity." Ben moved to block her path. "You leave this house, you die. And maybe we die with you." She glared at him. "Better me than your kid." Before Ben could answer, a low growl filled the hallway. Shadow had moved silently to Grace's flank, head low, teeth bared, but not snapping. His body blocked the stairs with military precision, a living barricade. Grace froze, eyes flicking down. "Easy, boy." Shadow didn't move. He stared at her jacket sleeve and then at her eyes, reading intentions the way he used to read scent trails. She took another step and his jaw clamped, not on skin, but on the fabric of her coat, a firm, unyielding grip. He held her like a handler holds a soldier back from the line. Ben had seen that exact posture in country. Not aggression. Intervention. "Shadow," Ben said softly. The dog didn't release. His eyes flicked to Ben once, then back to Grace. He was making his own decision. Grace sagged against the wall. "He won't let me go." "No," Ben said. "He won't." Tears sprang to her eyes, unexpected and angry. "I'm poison, Ben. Everyone who gets close to me ends up—" She choked on the rest. Ben stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen to me. If they're out there, if what you're saying is true, you're not the only one at risk. Leaving won't save us. It'll just make you easier to kill." Shadow released her sleeve but stayed in place, his body angled between her and the stairwell, a sentry at a choke point. His breathing was slow, deliberate, like a coiled spring waiting to snap. Grace slumped down to sit on the floor, back against the wall, her strength gone. "I don't want your kid to see what's coming." Ben crouched opposite her. "She's already seen more than she should. You running out into the snow isn't going to erase that. You want to keep her safe? Then help me figure out how to finish what you started." She closed her eyes, nodding faintly. "They're not just cops," she whispered. "They've got ex-military on payroll. They know how to track, how to cover footprints even in a blizzard. They think they're untouchable." Shadow finally sat, his body still between them and the stairs. He gave a single huff, like an exhalation. Ben swore he could read the dog's thoughts. "We're staying. We're fighting." Ben looked at Grace and, for the first time since he'd found her on the road, saw more than a wounded stranger. He saw a soldier who had been left without a unit. "Then they're not the only ones who know how to fight," he said. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a sound like distant engines. Shadow's ears twitched toward it. The moment passed between them, quiet but electric. The decision had been made. The crack between doubt and belief was closing, but so was the distance of their enemies. It was just after 3 a.m. when Shadow's body snapped upright from his post near the front door. No bark, just a sudden stillness, ears stiff, nose in the air. Ben, who had dozed off in the living room chair, woke the instant Shadow moved. Years of muscle memory and instinct had trained him to react to silence more than noise. Shadow padded toward the window, slow and purposeful. He stopped with his nose an inch from the glass, eyes locked on the darkness beyond the tree line. Ben followed his gaze but saw nothing but swirling snow. Still, he trusted the dog more than he trusted what he could see. He placed a hand on Shadow's shoulder and felt the tightness in the shepherd's muscles. "Something out there," Ben whispered. Shadow responded with a low, guttural growl, a sound that vibrated through Ben's arm, the kind of sound that only came out when the world on the other side of the window turned hostile. Ben moved quickly but quietly, checking the rifle beside the couch, flicking the safety, and double-checking the bolt. Upstairs, Grace stirred. A moment later she called down, "Is it them?" "I don't know yet," Ben said, though his gut told him yes. He turned off the remaining lights. The cabin fell into near darkness, lit only by the glow of embers in the stove. Outside, the snow glowed faintly under a sliver of moon. The quiet stretched too long to be natural. Then Shadow moved again. Fast this time. He bolted past Ben, skidding to a stop at the back door. His head snapped toward the far window, and he growled louder, teeth bared. Ben froze. That angle. The backside of the cabin. If someone were approaching without wanting to be seen from the road, that's where they'd come in. He rushed up the stairs and found Grace half-sitting, clutching the pistol he'd given her earlier. "We're not alone anymore," he said. She nodded grimly. "They were supposed to think I died in that crash. But if they think I survived..." "They do." Ben moved to the side window in the bedroom, pulled the curtain back just enough to see. Tracks. Not vehicle. Boot prints. Multiple sets, spaced tight. Trained movement. No flashlights, no talking. These weren't local deputies doing a welfare check. This was a team, and they were coming for blood. Grace swallowed hard. "They're not just dirty. They're organized. I mean, paramilitary organized. They've been moving weapons, military surplus, stolen shipments. They funnel them through confiscated evidence, cook the paperwork, and resell to buyers out of state. Sometimes international." "You said narcotics." "Both," she whispered. "And not just through street dealers. Some of the drugs end up in evidence lockers for cases that never go to court. Others disappear through clerical errors. Heroin, fentanyl, even ketamine. They're selling to people who don't even realize they're buying from cops." Ben stared at her. "How long?" "Years. At least 6. I only uncovered part of it. The rest? I think the chief is the middle link. But someone bigger is behind it. Someone with reach." "And you have proof?" Grace reached into the small day pack she'd hidden beneath the bed. From a side pocket, she pulled a second USB drive, wrapped in duct tape, and sealed inside a waterproof bag. "The drive you have is just a backup. This one's the real deal. Audio logs, file copies, video of drop-offs, conversations between officers, enough to rip apart a department, maybe a whole damn district." Ben took the drive and held it in his palm. It felt heavier than it should have. Shadow growled again, this time from the hallway. Ben turned just in time to see the dog crouched low, nose to the floor near the baseboards. Tracking. "What is it, boy?" Ben whispered. Shadow moved along the hallway, stopped at the window on the east side of the cabin, and stood still, eyes locked on a spot just beyond the trees. Ben crouched beside him. The moonlight caught the edge of something. Movement. A figure leaned against a tree, scanning the house through night vision goggles. Another crouched beside him, speaking into a radio. "They're here," Ben said. "And they're coordinating." Grace pulled herself to her feet, swaying slightly from the fever. "Then we run." Ben shook his head. "No, not yet." He turned to Shadow. The dog was already moving, back toward Ellie's room, tail rigid, posture alert but not panicked. He nosed the door open gently and slipped inside. Ben followed and found Ellie already sitting up, hugging her knees, wide-eyed. "I heard him growling," she said, "like the time with the cougar." Ben nodded. "You remember the plan?" She nodded. "Get dressed, grab my bag, follow Shadow. Don't stop unless he does." He kissed her forehead. "That's my girl." Ellie was already pulling on her coat and boots. Ben turned back to Grace. "We can't hold this cabin. Too many angles. Too easy to trap us. There's an old ranger station 2 miles east. Stone foundation. We can hole up there. You've got supplies?" "Cached years ago. I never stopped preparing." Grace managed a tired smile. "I'm glad one of us didn't quit." Ben looked down at Shadow, now waiting at the front door again, ears twitching. "I didn't quit," he said. "I just stopped hoping someone else would do the right thing." Outside, the first crunch of boots on snow approached the porch. Shadow's eyes locked with Ben's, and in that instant, the man and the dog moved as one. It wasn't over. Not even close. But Shadow had known before anyone. He'd heard what the night was hiding. And now, they would be ready. The snow was falling harder now, fat, wet flakes that melted instantly on contact with the skin but clung to clothing like glue. Shadow moved through the forest with calculated precision, his black coat already speckled in white, nose low to the ground. He wasn't just leading, he was reading. Every broken branch, every shift in scent, every subtle change in wind direction. He processed them faster than Ben could track with years of training. Behind him, Ben carried Grace in a modified fireman's carry. Her arms slung over his shoulder, one leg dragging with each step, but she bit back the pain. Ellie trailed behind, her small boots crunching softly in Shadow's footsteps, her backpack tight against her spine. She didn't complain, didn't whimper, just moved, one foot in front of the other, with her hand lightly on Shadow's tail for guidance. They had left the cabin 15 minutes before the breach. Shadow had given them just enough warning to slip out through the root cellar hatch Ben had built 5 winters ago, hidden under a false wood pile. From there, they disappeared into the tree line, swallowed by the storm. Ben didn't look back. He knew what they'd find. A still warm fire, discarded blankets, and a trail wiped clean by wind and snow. But it wouldn't fool them for long. Whoever they were good. They moved like a team, like soldiers. And if Grace was right, one of them wasn't just familiar. He was personal. They reached a ridge where the trees thinned into a clearing. The old Forest Service ranger station sat on a rise across a frozen creek, half swallowed by drifts. The roof sagged in the middle, windows long since shattered, but the walls held. It had once been Ben's shelter during his first winter off-grid, a place where grief didn't follow him so easily. Shadow crossed the creek first, testing the ice with each step. When he turned back and gave a single sharp breath, Ben moved fast, helping Grace down the slope and across while Ellie slid on her hands and knees beside them. Inside, it smelled of rot and pine sap. A raccoon nest had taken over the back corner, but the stone fireplace still stood, and so did the trap-door beneath the floorboards. Ben had stashed emergency supplies here years ago. MREs, medical kits, thermal blankets, even a shotgun and ammunition sealed in oilcloth. He worked quickly, lighting a fire, stripping off wet gear, wrapping Grace in blankets. Her skin was cold, but her eyes stayed sharp. Shadow paced the perimeter of the room, circling slowly, then pausing by the boarded window. He growled once, quiet, uncertain. "What is it, boy?" Ben asked. Shadow didn't answer with noise this time. He sat back and stared at the window, waiting. Grace pulled herself upright with effort. "He smells them." Ben looked through the broken slats. Nothing but trees and snow. "He smells more than that," Grace continued. "He knows who they are." Ben turned to her. "You said someone in that team was familiar to me. Who?" She hesitated. "Mark Delaney." Ben felt the name hit like a body shot. "No, Mark's dead. No, he just switched uniforms, works private security now, quiet contracts, ghost work. He's on their payroll." Ben looked away, jaw clenched. He hadn't seen Mark since Kabul, since the IED. "He pulled me out of a burning Humvee," Ben said quietly. "Stayed with me 3 hours under fire until the medevac came. He saved my life." "Then he sold his soul afterward?" Grace replied. "I saw him. In uniform. He was at the drop point where evidence went missing. He spoke to Morrison like they'd known each other for years." Shadow shifted again, moving back to Ellie. She crouched beside him, hand on his shoulder. The dog leaned into her, then pressed his nose against her chest as if checking her heartbeat. "I don't believe it," Ben muttered. "You don't want to," Grace said. "But if we stay here long enough, you'll see him up close." Ben opened the trapdoor, revealing the small crawl space and supply chamber. He tossed down a thermal mat, extra rations, and Ellie's blanket. "Ellie, go down with Shadow," he said. "Take your book and the flashlight, just for a little while." "Is the dog coming too?" she asked. "He's not going anywhere without you." Ellie nodded and crawled down. Shadow followed without hesitation, his frame barely fitting through the opening. He turned once he was inside, placing himself between the door and Ellie's curled-up body. Ben closed the trap and covered it with the rug. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the storm had thinned, giving way to a silence so pure it made every twig snap sound like thunder. Ben knelt by the window and scanned the trees again. "I need to know everything you saw, Grace. Names, places, schedules." She handed him the second drive. "I was supposed to meet an FBI contact in Denver. Tomorrow morning. I never made it." Ben slipped the drive into his coat. "If Delaney's out there," he said, "we'll need more than proof. We'll need leverage." Grace's eyes were already starting to close. "You sure you're ready to fight a war again?" Ben glanced at the floor where his daughter and Shadow hid beneath their feet. "No. But I've got a dog who is." And he meant it. Shadow wasn't just guarding Ellie. He was waiting for the signal, the same way he had in another war, another country, beside another man with too much to lose. Now he was home. And the enemy was coming to him. The wind had quieted, but inside the ranger station, the air was heavier than any storm. The fire had gone down to coals, casting long shadows across the cracked walls and broken window frames. Ben stood by the front entrance, rifle in hand, listening, not for movement, but for silence. That particular kind of silence that came before a breach. Grace lay on the mat near the fire, wrapped in a thermal blanket, pistol tucked beneath her ribs. Her skin had gone pale again, the flush of fever creeping back. Still, her eyes remained sharp, locked on the door. "I can hear them," she whispered. "The way they move. They don't talk. No panic, just efficiency." Ben nodded. "That's not law enforcement. That's something else." Below them, in the crawl space, Ellie lay curled against Shadow's side. The shepherd's body was still, but his eyes stayed open, tracking every sound above them. His breathing had slowed into something measured, almost meditative. Then it happened. A whisper of movement outside, a crunch in the snow, too soft for boots, too rhythmic for wildlife. Ben took position beside the window, peeking through a sliver of board. Flashlights flicked through the trees. No beam lingered. No one called out. There were 4 of them, maybe 5, spaced like a fire team. Then a low voice came through the front wall. "Ben, it's Delgado. I know you're in there." Ben froze. Delgado. He hadn't heard that name spoken in 6 years. Back then, it had meant something. Sergeant Matt Delgado, the man who'd pulled Ben from the kill zone in Ramadi, who'd carried him through fire, who bled with him, prayed with him, and disappeared after discharge like a ghost. "You don't have to do this," the voice continued. "We just want Nolan. You give her up, you walk away. You and your daughter live." Grace stirred. "He's lying." Ben didn't move. Delgado's voice was clearer now, closer. "I've still got scars from that day outside Mosul, man. I didn't forget, but this isn't about you and me." She made her bed. Ben stepped into the firelight. "You made yours too, didn't you?" There was a pause. "I did what I had to." "You think any of this is clean? You think the badge means anything anymore? They own the whole system, Ben. We're just survivors." "No," Ben said. "You're a damn traitor." A flash of light cut through the front window. The instant it passed, Ben ducked. A round cracked into the doorframe, sending splinters flying. Shadow heard it. In the crawl space, Ellie flinched, but Shadow didn't move. He waited, head lowered, ears twitching for the next cue. Outside, feet pounded snow. Someone was circling left. Ben moved fast, kicking open the back door and stepping out into the storm. The cold hit like a slap, but he ignored it. He kept low, flanking the side of the cabin. Snow muffled his steps. He reached the corner and saw a figure crouched near the firewood pile, Ajadrisat pistol in hand. Ben didn't hesitate. He stepped out, drove the stock of his rifle into the man's temple, dropping him before he could raise the weapon. Another shadow moved behind the outhouse. Delgado's men. Professional. Quiet. No insignias. No names. Inside the station, Grace struggled to sit. The door creaked. She raised the pistol. Matt Delgado stepped through the threshold. She didn't fire. He wasn't holding a weapon. "Don't," he said, lifting both hands. "You'll miss." She aimed anyway. Her hand was shaking. "You're sick," he said. "You've got maybe an hour left before infection takes your brain." "You'll be dead before that," she hissed. Delgado took one step forward. "You don't know who you're playing with, Nolan. Morrison was just a link. You think you're going to save anyone with a flash drive? They'll erase you. They'll erase this whole damn town." Grace's breath hitched. That's when Shadow moved. The trap door above him had opened. Ellie stood above, frozen in terror, too afraid to cry out. Delgado turned toward her, and that was enough. Shadow lunged. He cleared the trap opening like a missile. All muscle and precision, he struck Delgado mid-chest, knocking the wind out of him, sending both man and dog to the floor. Grace pulled herself up, dragged her body toward Ellie, shielding the girl with her own. Delgado grunted, rolling onto his back. Shadow clamped his jaws just above the man's throat, enough pressure to freeze movement, but not draw blood. A warning. Absolute and primal. Ben came through the door seconds later, rifle raised. "Don't move," he said. Delgado's eyes met Ben's. They weren't the eyes of a killer. Not fully. Not yet. They were tired. Hollow. "You're late," Grace whispered, wincing. Ben moved to her side. "You good?" "I'm here." Ben turned to Delgado. "Why?" Delgado didn't fight. "You ever lose control, Ben? Ever get tired of losing good people while the bastards in suits rake in millions? You don't fix it by becoming one of them." "They had leverage," Delgado said. "Pictures. My daughter. One mistake at college, one party. They made it clear, either I work for them or her life disappears." Ben didn't lower the rifle. "Then you should have found another way." Delgado looked at Ellie, then at Shadow, who still had his teeth against his neck. "I was supposed to kill the girl too," he said, voice flat. Ben's finger tightened on the trigger. "I didn't," Delgado added quickly. "I told them you were already gone when we got here. I stalled them." Shadow growled again, a low rumble of judgment. "Get up," Ben said, slowly. Delgado did, with Shadow circling, staying close enough to strike. Outside, faint sirens echoed through the trees. Grace blinked. "You called someone?" Ben shook his head. "No, but someone heard." Delgado backed against the wall, hands still up. "It's over, Ben, but you've started something you won't be able to stop." Ben stepped closer. "Good." Shadow moved to Ellie's side, nudging her back down into the trap door, licking her cheek once before returning to stand between the girl and the man who'd nearly ended them all. And in the firelight, Ellie whispered, not to anyone in particular, "He knew before we did. Shadow knew." Ben nodded. "Yeah, baby. He always does." The fire in the ranger station had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The room smelled of wet wood, gun oil, and adrenaline. Outside, the sirens had faded into silence again, swallowed by the wilderness. Snow tapped softly against the roof. Inside, Matt Delgado sat on the floor, his back to the wall, wrists zip-tied in front of him. His breathing had slowed, but the weight of everything he wasn't saying still filled the room like smoke. Shadow stood a foot away, body angled toward him, ears twitching with each shift of the man's posture. Ben sat across from Matt, rifle across his lap. He hadn't taken his eyes off the man since the standoff ended. Not because he feared another attack, but because he didn't understand. "What did they offer you?" Ben finally asked. "Money? Power?" Matt didn't look up. "They offered me a future, or at least they threatened to erase hers." "Your daughter?" Matt nodded slowly. "Sophia. Sophomore year. She made a mistake at a college party. Pictures got taken. Wrong people got them. Next thing I know, I'm getting calls from a number that never shows up on caller ID. They knew everything about her. Her classes, her roommate, her mental health history. They didn't ask for money. They asked for me." Ben felt the sick twist of it. The quiet kind of war. The kind that didn't use bombs or guns. Just pressure. Precision. "You didn't try to fight it?" Ben asked. Matt let out a sharp breath. I did. At first, I said no. They sent a picture of her walking home alone at night. I didn't say no again. Shadow shifted, his gaze never leaving Matt's Viten. Grace, still pale and leaning against the arm of the couch, finally spoke. So you became the enforcer, the cleaner. Matt's jaw flexed. I became what I had to be, until tonight. No, Grace said. You still have a choice. Ben turned to her. What are you doing? She met his eyes. Giving him one. She reached into her coat and pulled out the second USB. The real one. The one with everything. You help us finish this, she said to Matt. You testify. You hand over everything you know, names, dates, shipments, bank accounts. You become the reason they fall. And if I don't? Matt asked. Ben stood. Then you go down with them. Matt laughed bitterly. You think the FBI's going to protect me? I'm the guy who was on the other side of the door tonight. Grace glanced down at Shadow, then looked back at Matt. You're right. They won't trust you. Not yet. But they'll listen if someone vouches. Someone who's not one of them. Matt raised an eyebrow. You? No. Grace said, shaking her head. Him. She whistled once, low and soft. Shadow looked at her. She gave the barest nod. Shadow stepped forward, not aggressive, not threatening, just present. He moved with slow, deliberate purpose until he stood inches from Matt. Then he sat, quiet, still. You know what this means, right? Grace said. Matt looked down at the shepherd. He's not barking. No. Ben said. He's waiting. For what? For you to decide what kind of man you are. Silence stretched, thick and heavy. Matt leaned his head back against the wall, exhaled slowly. They're not just in Cedar Ridge, he said finally. This thing's bigger than anyone realizes. It's a network. Other towns, other departments, even judges. Once you're in, they don't let you out. Ben stepped closer. Then you give us the map. Matt looked at Shadow again. And if I do, he stops watching me like I'm still a threat? Grace answered before Ben could. No, he keeps watching, but now it'll be on your side. Matt closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something had shifted. His posture, his voice, his purpose. I'll testify. Everything I know. But I want protection for Sophia. Full immunity, relocation, a clean record. You'll get it, Ben said, if your information holds. Matt nodded slowly. You're going to need a second drive. I've got backups hidden in a shed 2 miles east of here. Metal ammo box, buried under a false floor. Shadow stood up suddenly, ears pivoting. Ben followed the dog's gaze toward the window. Just wind. But Shadow didn't relax. Ben understood. The danger wasn't over, just changed. You'll take us there, Ben said to Matt. Yeah. Matt muttered. Might as well burn what's left of the bridges. Grace leaned back again, exhaustion catching up to her. You just saved more lives than you know, but don't think that makes you clean. Matt nodded once. I don't. Shadow walked back toward Ellie's hiding spot under the floor. He paused, looked back at Matt, and for the first time all night, gave a quiet whine. A signal. Not approval, not forgiveness, but maybe, just maybe, acknowledgement. The line between soldier and traitor was thin, but tonight Shadow had drawn it, and Matt had chosen which side to stand on. Now, there was a chance. A narrow one. And a dog was the first to believe it. The first warm sunlight in days spilled across the ridge, slicing through the last remnants of storm like a slow exhale. Snow still blanketed the ranger station and the valley below, but it was melting now, softened at the edges, dripping from branches, surrendering to spring. Inside, the cabin was quiet. Grace Nolan sat in the corner, her back supported by a pillow against the stone wall, a blanket wrapped tight around her legs. The deep gash in her side had been cleaned, stitched, and dressed with antibiotics that Ben had kept sealed for years. The color was back in her face, and her voice had stopped shaking when she spoke. The fever had broken last night. This morning, she was alive in a way she hadn't been in weeks. Shadow lay beside her, one paw on her boot like a silent guard. Not tense, just present. Across the room, Ellie knelt at the low wooden table, tongue pressed between her lips as she focused on a piece of paper with a box of crayons spread around her like a battlefield of color. Ben leaned against the window frame, arms folded. He was watching her draw, but his mind was miles away, tracking details, reviewing contingency plans, calculating who might still come looking. The immediate threat was over, but the war Grace had brought into his home was far from finished. The FBI had arrived just before dawn, dropped in by helicopter when the road proved impassable. Their approach had been careful. Shadow had remained between them and Ellie until Ben gave the signal. They took Matt Delgado into custody without resistance. He had not asked for a lawyer. He asked for a pen and paper. Grace handed over the USB drives with the calm of someone who had carried them like shrapnel for too long. She gave her statement with sharp clarity. Names, transactions, surveillance footage. The reach of the corruption spread beyond Cedar Ridge. Officers, administrators, private security firms. Evidence had already started cross-referencing with federal databases. Justice had started to move, slow but inevitable. The agents had offered Ben a commendation, a recommendation for re-entry into tactical command. One of them mentioned a slot opening at Quantico, said he could be valuable there, training the next generation, doing some good from the inside. Ben had listened politely and declined. "I've got a different mission," he said, glancing at Ellie. "One that matters more than the last one." The agent nodded and didn't ask again. Now Ben stepped forward and crouched beside the table, watching Ellie put the finishing touches on her drawing. "Tell me what's going on here," he said gently. She held up the picture. 4 figures under a bright yellow sun. A tall man with messy hair, a woman with a badge on her chest, a dog with big ears and a wagging tail, and a little girl holding all 3 hands. "We made it out," she said, "out of the storm." Ben swallowed against the lump in his throat. "It's beautiful," he said. Shadow gave a soft huff, almost like a chuckle. Grace shifted and looked toward them. "She didn't draw the cabin." Ellie shook her head. "Because that part's behind us now." Ben walked over and taped the picture to the stone fireplace. It fluttered slightly in the breeze from the cracked window. Grace looked at Shadow, who had now settled his head in her lap, content, but alert. "They offered him a medal, you know," she said. Ben smiled. "And he refused, I'm guessing. He tried to eat it." They laughed quietly. Shadow's tail thumped once. Outside, the sun climbed higher, lighting the tracks in the snow leading away from the station. Tracks that would melt by nightfall. Tracks that had carried a girl, a soldier, a cop, and a dog into something they hadn't expected to survive. But they had. And now the real work would begin. Shadow stood up, stretched, and walked over to the front door. He sat down with his back straight, ears forward, nose twitching. Not anxious, just ready, because the world hadn't changed overnight. But this pack had, and Shadow would always be the first to know when it was time to move again. Spring had come to Wyoming not in a rush, but in cautious steps. The snow receded like a tide, revealing damp earth, crushed pine needles, and stubborn green shoots poking through the thaw. The old ranger station still stood where the storm had found them, though now it sat quiet, more memory than refuge. Ben's cabin, tucked deeper into the trees, had changed in small but unmistakable ways. A new coat of paint on the porch rail Ellie used as her jungle gym, a second rocking chair beside his, and on most evenings the shape of a German shepherd stretched across the threshold, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but always aware. Shadow had returned to his post. But now he was watching over more than one soul. Grace Nolan had moved into a small house down the road in early June. She accepted a role as a liaison between the FBI's Denver office and a newly formed local corruption task force. Officially, she was remote support. Unofficially, she was the reason the task force existed. She hadn't spoken to Matt Delgado since the day he was taken into custody. She didn't ask about his sentence, though she heard rumors of a plea deal and a sealed deposition that helped unwind 3 more city networks across state lines. Ben never asked, and she never offered. What mattered was what they were building here. Grace didn't come over every day, but she stopped by often enough that Ellie had started referring to her as the boss of my second favorite adult. The first, she made clear, was Shadow. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when it happened. Nothing dramatic, nothing scripted, just sunlight pouring through the kitchen window. The smell of banana bread in the oven. Ellie, seated at the kitchen table with a paper and crayon in hand, working on a school project titled Heroes in My Life. She had drawn 3 figures, her dad, wearing a flannel shirt and a smile, Grace, holding a badge and standing proud, and Shadow, bigger than both, with his tongue out and his body curved slightly toward her like a shield. When it came time to present in class, Ellie stood in front of her 3rd-grade classmates, feet planted, voice steady. "My dog saved someone," she said, not just once, but twice. She didn't cry. She didn't exaggerate. She just told the story of a snowy night, a cabin in the woods, and a shepherd who had refused to leave anyone behind. Ben got a call from her teacher that night, just to say it was the quietest the room had ever been, that a few of the kids had gone home and asked their parents what it meant to be brave. At home, Shadow lay by the front door, same as always. But now, when Grace came to visit, he didn't just stand between her and the world. He leaned against her leg, nudged her hand for a scratch, stood sentinel when she laughed or closed her eyes too long. Ben noticed the change and said nothing. He didn't need to. One evening, Grace brought over takeout and a bottle of wine. They ate on the porch while Ellie chased frogs by the creek, and Shadow alternated glances between the woods and the child he now considered his responsibility. "You ever think," Grace said softly, "about how different this would have been if you hadn't stopped the truck that night?" Ben nodded. "I didn't stop it. Shadow did." Grace smiled. "Yeah, he always seems to know, doesn't he?" They sat in silence for a while, the sun dipping low behind the ridge, painting the sky in long strokes of gold and rose. When the first star appeared, Ellie climbed into Ben's lap, sleepy and warm. Shadow came over, pressing his nose gently into her shoulder before lying down at their feet. Grace looked at them, this odd little pack held together by history, hurt, and healing, and said quietly, "Some scars are maps. They don't always point to where you've been. Sometimes they show you where you're meant to go." Ben didn't answer, but his hand found Shadow's head, rubbing behind one ear in that exact spot the dog always leaned into. That night, As the cabin lights dimmed and the wind carried the scent of pine through open windows, Shadow lay across the front door once more. Not because he had to, but because this place, this family, was worth guarding. And for those who listened closely, his breathing seemed to say, "I'm still watching. I always will be." What remains after the storm isn't just survival. It's the bond forged in silence, loyalty and instinct stronger than words. Shadow didn't save the day with teeth or speed. He saved it with presence, with trust. And in a world that often forgets, maybe it's time we remember. What's your story with a loyal pet? If Shadow reminded you of a dog you've loved, or one still curled at your feet, share this story. Tell someone. Let the world know that courage comes in all shapes, and sometimes it has 4 legs and eyes that never stop watching. Follow and support our channel, German Shepherd, for more real stories that honor the quiet heroes, because not all guardians wear capes, some wear fur.